be looking at the ethical consideration for nurses in a pandemic or other emergency. 2007 states that the nursing profession plays an integral role in all aspects of emergencies, including mitigation, response, and recovery. And if anyone can remember SARS 2003, you will recall the panic and terror of a new illness that no one understood. Within the first 2 weeks, the first-line workers, healthcare professionals, including nurses, were falling seriously ill, and some were dying from this new disease. Reflecting back on this, there is considerable discourse in the healthcare world on the responsibility of healthcare workers towards their patients during a major health emergency or pandemic. As a self-regulated profession, licensed nurses are accountable for the entry to practice competencies for registered nurses governed by the College of Nurses of Ontario, one of which is ethical practice. According to Beaucroft and Childress, 1983, the 4 key ethical issues that nurses must navigate are autonomy, the respect the rights of the individual, beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, not doing harm, and justice, specifically looking at equity. As nurses, there is an expectation under beneficence and justice of duty to provide care. In a retrospective study by Upshur et al., 2005, it was determined that healthcare workers lack clarity about their duty to provide care during a communicable disease outbreak. The response from the Canadian Nursing Association was to create a code of ethics for registered nurses that states during a natural or human-made disaster, including a communicable disease outbreak, nurses have a duty to provide care using appropriate safe precautions. Obviously, the idea of duty to do care during an epidemic is complex and why? Because self-interest of individual nurses versus interest of patients in their care. Some believe that nurses have the right to protect their own health and the health of their family, while others believe that care for patients is an integral part of the nurse's professional values, whatever the personal cost to the nurse. So I have a problem. Well, at least 4, because especially as a single mom of 4 children, I have a duty as a mother to protect and care for my children. And what is my obligation? What is my obligation as a mother, and what is my obligation as a nurse for my patients? According to the Joint Centre of Bioethics and the Public Health Agency of Canada, they recognize that the needs and obligations of healthcare workers to their families need to be included in the pandemic plans, and employers need to support their workers. Which sounds great and feels like we should be supported, but do I have to disclose to my employer my family obligations? At what point do I need to do that? Do I have to do it during my employment prior to a pandemic? What implications does this have? What does this mean for my... So to support nurses to examine their own readiness to be part of a pandemic plan in relation to their own circumstances, the Ontario Health Plan for an Influenza Pandemic Questionnaire was developed by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. And basically it was to identify... Great, so I can identify that I have to prepare to leave my children in the care of someone else so that I can carry out my professional responsibilities to care for my patient. Don't get me wrong. I understand that as nurses, we're needed in times of an emergency. There will be a need for resources for trained professionals like firefighters, police, and other human health resources. It's like what happened with 9/11. I have the utmost respect for those. As a nurse, my patients, their welfare, safety, and care are extremely important to me. But what scares me most about all of this is that there is a possibility of emergency legislation that compels healthcare workers to work during a crisis. Sounds a lot like conscription. Under emergency legislation, provinces, territories may have the authority to designate what is an essential service, and they will have the ability to compel people's time and property with due compensation as a last resort. But what is a last resort? Who gets to decide that? And Olson says that deciding whether to report to work in a disaster is not always easy, but being prepared individually and through institution policy, it is the primary ethical demand disasters make of healthcare professionals. To anticipate, deliberate, and prepare is part of the social contract or duty of healthcare professionals to provide care, according to the ICN 2006. The Canadian Pandemic Influenza Plan for the healthcare sector essentially states that healthcare workers are the first to receive vaccines under the principle of reciprocity, in alignment with this idea of the social contract, which demands healthcare professionals respond in an infectious disease or any other emergency. So as nurses, we sign an invisible social contract, which states that we will take care of others over ourselves and our family. So for this nurse, the question still remains, in an epidemic or an emergency, what would I do?